Open up the door, it's Dave!
On a recent video, I talked about how I charged my car to 100% and then left it in the sun and the fans ran. And it received a bit of feedback, a few comments along the way, before I turned off the commentary because it changed in nature a little bit. But the concept was people were asking questions about EV charging and how EV charging works and sort of this idea of the paradigm of EV charging and what's wrong with it. And that's when I stumbled upon this article, all about some of the EV charging habits and the mental models that we have about charging that need to change or be updated over time. So I thought I'd take a few minutes and take you through this scholarly article and talk about EV charging and the mental models that go along with it. The paper is called Mental Models Guide Electric Vehicle Charging. I found it on ScienceDirect.com, and you can go out there and take a look at it. I'll put a link below in the description, so you can go out and read it. It's by Francis Spry and William Kempton, and it's from last month. And it's really kind of interesting because it takes a look at the mental models we use when we think about charging cars. I'll also put a link below to an article I found that sort of summarized it in a different way that may be helpful to you to understand it in a more summary sense if you're just reading through it. But the idea here is that these two researchers were thinking about how you charge your car and what you do with it, and how that relates to the transfer of learning from what we know about gas-powered cars, internal combustion engines, and the way that we fuel them. There's a thought process in the way we fuel cars. If you get in a car today, an internal combustion engine car that requires gas, you know how to do it. You're going to look at the gas gauge. You're going to decide when you need to go to the gas station. You may select gas stations based on price or other factors like that, but you have a mental model for how you do that. When you get into an electric vehicle, you don't think like that. The paper is pretty good at thinking about how we relate to charging, and they asked some good questions of the people that they included in the study. But at the end of it all, what they talked about was three specific mental models. One, where someone monitors the fuel gauge, and when low, seeks a refill location. So this is that liquid fueling model. This is what we do when we drive an internal combustion engine. The second is prior to a trip, plan where and when to charge. And the third is to use event-triggered charging. And that's unique to the EV model. That's where you know that you need to charge based on something that's going on. And it's not something that we think about intuitively as we get into an EV for the first time. I've talked in the past about people going in and having trouble with an EV and not knowing where to charge, when to charge, how to charge, what they need to do. And this is where it comes into the interesting commentary that the Tesla cars themselves, they do a really good job with the supercharger network of laying it out for you so you know exactly how to get from point A to point B. A friend of mine recently bought a Tesla, and he was asking me, hey, how do I know when to charge and what to do? I said, when you're around town and you're home, just plug your car in when you're home. But when you're going out, if you're going a longer distance, just put the destination in there. It will do the online routing for you, and it will figure out if you need to charge along the way and precondition the batteries to be ready to accept a charge. And you'll be on your way in a short amount of time. And each one of these charges will take about 15 minutes or so to keep you on your way. But you're relying on the car to do the thought for you, to take away the mental model and actually create a fourth mental model where I just set it and forget it. And I walk away from it and I let it decide when it's going to charge. I can, of course, deviate from that if I want to for any reason, but I can leave it to do that. But the rub is that the other EV cars that are out there, they don't have that. There is no easy way to set up the charging, do your routing, and do it as part of the car's equipment. You have to use some sort of third-party software, do something to be prepared for charging, and move along in a different way. So one of these three models becomes very important. And that's why I point people to PlugShare all the time. Look, I have no connection to this company. I just like what they do because they give you all of the charging stations that are around. It's community supported, so people can put in information about charging stations that pop up or disappear for that matter. And you can go around and you can kind of plan your route that way. Or you could use a tool like a Better Route Planner, which allows you to use an app or a website to be able to plan a route that goes along and actually finds charging destinations based on what type of car you're driving and the state of charge that you start with. It's really helpful, but it still doesn't solve the problem overall. So it's sort of offline route planning, and you have to have some method for getting to where you want to go, and you need to figure out where the fast charging is, which companies you want to deal with, because there are a lot of companies out there that provide fast charging. Well, maybe not that many, but you have like EVgo and Electrify America, and FP&L in Florida has its own charging stations, and ChargePoint and others. So you have to decide what the right place is that you're going to charge as you're going along and make sure that you have an account with it. So it's not as simple as the Tesla model. So one of these mental models does in fact exist for all the other car companies, at least until they start integrating with the Tesla model and doing some things. Now, what I found interesting was as they went through this and they thought about what this means, there's a lot of study out there about this. There's a lot of mental modeling that happens. We learn something as we're growing up. We learn all these different things. You first drive a car and you learn how to put it in gear. You learn where the gas pedal is. You learn where the brake is. And you learn how to get out there and put gas in your car. But EVs have a user battery interaction, which is kind of a funny way to say that people have to think about how to charge. Now, I'll tell you a story about the first car I ever owned. Apparently, the gas gauge was broken, and I didn't know that. So I was driving the car. It was going from a full tank down to about a quarter of a tank after a week or two or whatever it was. And I'm driving the car, and it's still at a quarter of a tank, and the car just dies. And I'm like, what just happened? And I wound up calling my dad, and my dad's like, are you sure it has gas? And I'm like, it says it has a quarter of a tank. I don't understand. But sure enough, it didn't have gas. So I had a good learning experience there that you always need to be aware of your car and what you're doing with it to make sure that you're putting gas in it. That mental model for me kind of carried over to a large degree with the idea of EV charging. I don't want it to get below 10%, but if it does, I need to get a charge and make sure I'm taking care of it. But I know that I can still get to a charging station. But back to the study, they make a point of saying that there's math in everyday life, that people sometimes have to stop and think about and do a little math in their heads to figure something out. And that seems to be the case with EV charging. People are thinking about, well, what does a percentage mean versus how many miles do I have left? The mental model of the gas gauge going from full to empty gives you a representation of what's going on there. You know that the car gets 30 miles to the gallon. You know it has a 15-gallon tank, so you can do the math and figure out how far it should be able to go. You also know that as you're driving it, it's going to be using that gas, and you kind of have a sense of how many miles you're going to have left when you get to that quarter of a tank, because that quarter of a tank makes sense. When you're looking at the percentage of charge, it's a different thing. Miles would help, but not necessarily solve the problem. It's just this idea that you can't necessarily equate the two and you can't think about where I'm going to charge. I'm driving on the highway and I know that I can stop and I can get gas at the next off ramp. I can just go there and there'll be a gas station. I don't know that there'll be an EV charging station there unless I happen to actually know that there's one there. There's no guarantee that there's going to be one there. So that's where the math comes in and people have to think really hard about what they're doing with their cars and how they use them. They also go on to talk about the time spent in charging or putting gas in your car. And of course, that is a real world consideration. I mentioned before that if you drive your Tesla and you take it somewhere and you stop at superchargers along the way, you know that the maximum you're going to have to stop for is about 15 minutes. You'll go in, you'll stop for that length of time, you'll continue on your way. That's just the way it's set up, but it's still 15 minutes. And it's still, considering the range of the battery is maybe 300 miles, let's say, you have to charge up fairly frequently. You have to stop for 15 minutes several times, where if you're driving a gas-powered car, you know that you probably won't have to stop in that 300 miles. And you may have to stop, somewhere at 500 or 600 miles, but you'll just stop for a couple of minutes, enough time to put the gas in the car and fill it back up, which takes, 5 minutes? So it's a different story. You have to think about it a little differently, and they actually include that in their calculation. And they wind up with some interviews with experienced EV users. And what they learned was kind of eye-opening as well. Most users do not understand the physical units or processes of charging. For cars, gas-powered cars, they do. So rather than use the physical mental model of storage, almost all experienced EV drivers carry over a virtual model from the graphic on the portable electronic devices. So you're looking at your phone and you decide when I need to charge your phone. It's the same idea, which makes it kind of an interesting way to look at it. People don't really use the displayed icons for much of anything to tell them anything. They're just trying to get a charge when they think they need it. And then finally, they talk about refilling strategies. There are cases for long trips and cases for driving around town. So the refilling strategy requires that you think about it in that sense, that you have to say, if I'm going to drive around town, I'm going to charge it up at home and just continue to charge it at home. But if I'm going on a road trip, something say over 50 miles, I have to think about how I'm going to charge my car. So I just find that really, really compelling. It's a good story, and I think it kind of shows what the problem is with EV charging, and it's why so many people can't adapt to the idea of EV charging. And I think the reality is that the concept of using a hybrid that actually can be electric for local driving and be gas for longer distance trips, solves that problem for most people and makes it easier to kind of get through the mental model here, the hurdle we have. And this is where the challenge is for most people. We can't get there. So as we think about how we get to the future of EV cars, maybe they're not the ultimate future. Maybe there's other things we can do. Or maybe we come up with better charging strategies. Maybe there are other things we could do to charge the cars so you don't have to go and pull into an EV charging station and do that. Supposing they could have the road be an EV charging electromagnet so that as you're driving along, it's continuing to put a charge in the car. Or suppose that you had solar panels on the roof of your car that can continue to charge the cars while it's outside. Those kinds of things would change the entire paradigm of what we're thinking about for EV charging. So I just wanted to share that with you because I found it really interesting, and I hope you do too. As I said, the actual link to the paper is below, as well as an article that's kind of interesting related to it.
What's your point, David?